I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that Makhachev versus Volkanovski was one of the most important fights in UFC history. In recent years, we've been a bit oversaturated with fights where somebody attempts to become a double champ, but this was something very rare and special. In this fight, we had the number 1 and number 2 fighters pound for pound stepping into the cage. The last time we saw a fight of this magnitude was probably when BJ Penn stepped up to fight GSP for the second time, and that was in 2009. There was also the case to be made that this was the highest skill level matchup we've ever seen. Going into UFC 284, Islam was on an 11-fight win streak, and Alexander a 12-fight win streak. To top it off, there was an interesting stylistic clash as well. Could Volk stop the wrestling of Makhachev and employ his next-level striking? Or would this be another brutal one-sided beatdown from the Dagestani Sambo master? Would we see something unexpected like Volkanovski pulling off a submission or Islam getting a KO on the feet? On paper, this was one of the most compelling matchups ever, and it absolutely delivered. We got one of the most thrilling and unexpected results in recent memory. Watching this fight live, I thought it could be scored 3-2 for either guy. And after rewatching it a few times, I still think that is true. Both fighters had a definitive round, and several rounds were razor close. Even though I don't really agree with the 49-46 card, I don't think it's so egregiously bad that it would qualify as a robbery, because in a few of these rounds, the deciding factor may have literally been a single strike. But for the sake of argument, let's talk about each round. Round 1 was pretty even for the first 3 minutes. They both landed almost exactly the same number of strikes, and they both hurt each other. Volk landed a straight left that sent Islam stumbling back into the fence, and Makhachev landed a wild combo that dropped Alex to one knee. Around 2 minutes and 55 seconds in, Islam landed a knee, then pushed Alex into the cage and started to take his back. A little later, he would land something akin to a sacrifice throw on Alex, and spent the next 80 or so seconds hunting for rear naked chokes that were defended by Volkanovski. Round 2 was the closest round in my opinion. They both landed exactly the same number of strikes, and the difference in control time was 4 seconds. The question here is, how do you score the punch that Volk landed in the sequence as Islam slipped/went for a takedown? Even in slow motion, it's a bit hard to decipher, so I can see giving a slight edge to Islam, as the punch he landed earlier more clearly hurt Volkanovski. Round 3 was another painfully close round, where neither man seemed to have the momentum for very long. The striking was almost identical, and it's hard to say that either fighter's striking was really more impactful than the others, except for a body kick from Islam and a leg kick from Volkanovski. Round 4 was probably the one that will be the most controversial. At least it's the one that I see most people arguing about. I think Islam was winning the first 90 seconds of the fight, because he did land a good straight left and a jab. Then he shot a beautifully timed takedown and got Alex to the mat. For the next 3 minutes, Islam was on Volk's back like a backpack, but he didn't really do anything with the position except hold on and go for a few ineffectual submission attempts while Alex talked shit and punched him over the shoulder. In fact, the most notable moment from the fight was probably Volkanovski ending the round while screaming at Islam from inside a body triangle. Now, I'm not going to be too cheeky here and say that I thought Volk won the round by throwing punches over his shoulder and talking shit, but I think this round does highlight the biggest issue with scoring in MMA. Islam had a body triangle for nearly 3.5 minutes, but Volk landed more than twice as many strikes. Now, you might say that they weren't particularly effective, but neither were Islam's quote-unquote submission attempts. This is ultimately where I think the scoring criteria outlined in the unified rules falters. It's just not explicit enough for scenarios as close and ambiguous as this. Do you interpret a submission attempt that was not even close to finishing a fight as effective grappling because theoretically it's closer to finishing the fight than some over-the-shoulder punches? Why? Because the other fighter had to defend the sub-attempts? If that is the case, you might as well say that any hard strike that could have knocked somebody out if it had landed should be scored as effective striking because the other fighter was forced to avoid or defend it. Of course, we can probably all agree that that wouldn't make any sense, so why do we apply the same kind of logic to submission attempts that are nowhere near close to putting somebody in danger or being finished? If a fighter achieves an advantageous position but doesn't do anything that produces immediate or cumulative impact with the potential to contribute to the end of the match, can you really score that as effective grappling? Holding on to a position is not easy, but what we're saying with this kind of logic is that if you can achieve a position and simply hold on to it for a period of time, you've won the entire stage of the fight, purely because you maintained a so-called advantageous position. In my opinion, this sets up a bad precedent, where fighters can win fights by simply holding on to so-called advantageous positions and burning time. I know that some people really love grappling sports, and they judge the grappling exchanges in MMA through the lens of what would win you a grappling match. But MMA is not grappling. We should not score grappling exchanges in MMA with the same rule set and philosophy used to score wrestling, or BJJ, or Sambo, etc. Personally, I think Islam still won this round, because his striking early on was more effective in terms of what the unified rules describe. But the issue is that we keep finding ourselves having this same debate about whether holding on to a position or being more active should have won X or Y fighter the round. We need a more precise system breaking down and describing how certain positions and levels of activity should be scored. That said, I've really gone off topic here. Round 5 started off as a Makhachev round, with Islam landing some hard shots and briefly grounding Volk. But once again, Volkanovski was able to get back to his feet. At about 2:20, Islam shot again, but was not able to properly take Alex down. At this point, Makhachev was starting to fade, and Volk was turning up the heat. The two worked in the clinch for a while, with Alex controlling Islam against the fence and searching for takedowns of his own, but eventually they separated. With 70 seconds left, Alex landed a huge right hand that dropped Islam. Then he followed Islam to the ground and started to work from inside his guard. In hindsight, I think this was a mistake. Islam was gassed and hurt here. He was looking up at the clock every 10 seconds and just trying to weather the storm. Had Volk made Islam stand up, he probably could have gotten the KO. He did land some good shots on the ground, but Makhachev was able to hang on and survive. Still, it was an emphatic ending to the fight for Volkanovski. Several of these rounds were very close. In the case of rounds 2 and 3, it really might have come down to one strike tipping the scales, and you can make the case that either guy won 3 rounds. I said after Islam beat Charles Oliveira that I thought Volk had a better chance than a lot of people were giving him, but even I didn't see things playing out the way they did. I don't think anybody did. If you asked 1,000 people about this fight beforehand, I doubt you'd get a single person saying they see Volkanovski battering an exhausted Makhachev on the ground to end the fight. I've seen some people say Islam was exposed in this fight, or that his stock went down because he didn't look like Khabib 2.0. I don't know if that is really fair to say. Yes, he looked human in this fight, and it was against a smaller guy. It's also true that we've never seen Khabib put in a position like Islam was at the end of round 5, getting dropped and desperately trying to ride out a round from the bottom. Khabib also probably wouldn't have been so content to win a round by holding onto a body triangle like Islam did in round 4. But here's the thing. Khabib also never fought anyone as good as Volkanovski. That is just a fact. I don't think Islam was exposed, but I do think this fight confirms some of what I said after UFC 280. Islam's time at the top of the lightweight division is probably limited. As the old guard clears out, he's going to start facing some guys who can wrestle and strike. Guys who are of comparable size and can push the pace in the later rounds. In my opinion, if Beneil Dariush can get past Charles Oliveira, he presents a really interesting matchup for Islam. So do a few other guys climbing the ladder at 155 right now. With that in mind, this was still a very high-level performance, and to give him his due, Islam had unanticipated amounts of success against Volk in the stand-up department. Some of that was undoubtedly due to the size advantage, but you can't discount the skill and game planning that Islam showed. His striking looked surprisingly good to me. He had as much success in the feet against Volk in this fight as Max Holloway did over 15 rounds. That counter left hand was like a laser beam, and it was a problem for Alex all night long. In many cases, he was able to prevent Volk from implementing his usual tactics and techniques. Volkanovski's style is heavily based on feinting and faking to bait his opponents into throwing, then when they do, intercepting them mid-strike with blitzing charges. You didn't see him doing much of that in this fight, because Islam countered it with a simple but clever game plan. He waited for Alex to lead and then countered him with his own left hand when Alex was coming in. The open stance matchup also prevented Volk from getting his jab off with any consistency. From a purely statistical perspective, compare this fight to his third fight with Max. He landed 199 significant strikes. That's almost 3 times as many significant strikes as he landed on Islam. Against Korean Zombie, he landed 138. Against Ortega, he landed 214. In the second fight with Max, 137, and in their first fight, 157. No matter how you slice it, Islam drastically reduced Volkanovski's output. And although Alex was impressive with his ability to survive, escape, and even take Makhachev down, Islam did have a ton of success with his grappling. Before the fight, I predicted that Islam's chances would improve if he were to get Alex behind the black lines, and that turned out to be true. When he got Volk in that space, he was all over him with a variety of techniques to stifle and ground Alex. And when Volkanovski made a few small mistakes, Islam pounced on them with alacrity. Such as in the fourth, when Islam was clearly starting to tire, but secured the takedown and body triangle to prevent Alex from gaining any more momentum. That was a very smart and tactical, if not particularly devastating move. But at the end of the day, I think this fight said more about Volkanovski than Islam. Alex was the man who went up in weight for no other reason than to challenge himself. He did it against a man that many people were already anointing as the future greatest lightweight of all time. Before the fight, Volk said that he was going to wipe the smirk off of Islam's face. Regardless of whether or not he won the decision, he accomplished that personal goal. In the process, he did things that nobody expected. The general consensus beforehand was that if Islam was able to get the takedown, the fight would be over for Volkanovski, and that didn't turn out to be true. Yes, he did lose a few rounds, but Islam was basically forced to win those rounds through control. In many cases, Volk was able to escape and get back to his feet, exactly as he said he would. In the 5th round, it was Islam who was gassed. Islam was the one getting dropped and holding on for dear life to avoid a TKO. By the end of the fight, that smirk was completely gone. If we look at the fight as a whole, Alex did better. He outlanded Islam in both significant and total strikes. He knocked Makhachev down. He ended the fight authoritatively with the most dominant round any of them had. And when it was over, he was the fresher fighter. Volk looked like he could have gone another 2 rounds, while Islam was exhausted and kind of looked like the guy who lost. Obviously, we don't determine who gets the belt by who won the fight as a whole. However, if you view this fight through the lens of pound for pound as it was presented, I think it's something to take into consideration. As a whole, Alex had a better performance. He did what virtually nobody thought he could. He went up in weight against a seemingly invincible fighter and gave the bigger guy an incredibly close fight. This was the most adversity we have seen Islam face in his career outside of a flash knockout. Think about what the term pound for pound actually means. It's posing the question of, if size was not a factor, who would be the better fighter? Now ask yourself, if Islam and Alex were the same size, do you see Islam winning that fight? Based on the results from this fight, I don't think so. And therefore, I don't think you can say that he should take Volk's spot in the pound for pound rankings, because Volk embodied the very concept of pound for pound in this fight. All in all, this was an extremely close and competitive fight that, from what I've seen, had everybody on the edge of their seats. After the fight, both men expressed interest in an immediate rematch. Although I'm usually not a fan of immediate rematches, I think they should probably strike while the iron is hot with this one. There is a ton of hype behind this fight and Alexander Volkanovski in general, and it would be a dumb promotional decision to squander it all. Besides, there isn't a clear contender at 155 right now, so the fight wouldn't be holding the division up. Now, I wrote and recorded this review after the fights, and I wanted to get this video out sooner, but a few issues got in the way of that, which may have been slightly better in the long run, because an interesting story has been developing in the aftermath of UFC 284. Following the event, Volkanovski's teammate, Dan Hooker, accused Islam Makhachev of using an IV to rehydrate, saying, quote, "Dumb cunt thinks he can fly to Australia, hire a nurse to give him an IV, and we won't find out. Cheating dog." And, "Islam is a cheat." End quote. Independent from Hooker's bold accusations on Twitter, Alexander Volkanovski made remarks about Islam using an IV when he appeared on the MMA Hour after the fight. With 2 members of Volk's team mentioning an IV, people started to dig a bit. When they did, they discovered an anomalous bruise on the inside of Islam's elbow prior to UFC 284. Makhachev's co-manager Rizvan Magomedov would comment on the bruise, saying that it was the result of a blood test administered by the Aussie Commission on Wednesday morning, which, if you think about it, does kind of preclude this specific mark from actually being related to IV rehydration, because it was visible before the weigh-ins. Also, it is worth noting that according to the USADA testing policy, IV rehydration of over 100 milliliters does not require a temporary use exemption if it is determined to be medically justified treatment for dehydration and administered by a medical professional. Where this gets more complicated is the fact that the fighter still has to obtain permission from the Athletic Commission. An even bigger issue here is that regardless of the UFC's drug testing policy, the Western Australian Athletic Commission does not allow intravenous therapies in aiding rehydration from excessive or deliberate dehydration. So Islam could be screwed irrespective of what USADA says. As of right now, Islam and most of the people around him have denied the accusations, or simply accused Dan Hooker of being salty over the result of the fight. But there is one interesting twist here. In a now deleted tweet from Islam's other manager, Ali Abdelaziz, Ali may have accidentally implied that Islam did use an IV. Quote, "For all those idiots out there, any fighter under the UFC banner can take 2 to 3 liters of IV as long as it's done by a nurse or professional. Next week I'm going to expose everybody. Islam Makhachev is the pound for pound king." End quote. So, That isn't true, as we just discussed. IVs over 100 mils are only permitted if administered by a medical professional and if deemed to be medically necessary, and the commission still needs to be notified before the fight. Even if this was an honest mistake, it's an odd pivot away from Islam didn't use an IV. If nothing else, the optics of this tweet are not great, which is probably why Ali deleted it. Although it would be funny if this slip-up was enough for the Aussie Commission to take a deeper look into the situation. At least for the moment, it remains unclear what, if anything, will come of this controversy. It may be the case that Islam did not take an IV, but if he did, that's where the problems can start. If he went behind the backs of the Athletic Commission and USADA by getting an IV off the books, he could be looking at some kind of penalty. In the case of USADA, an IV violation carries a 2-year suspension. Assuming nothing happens, it would still add a little more fuel to this rivalry. The only thing missing from their first meeting was bad blood, and this IV controversy has just created that element for the promotional machine. It's just another reason why I think they should make the rematch as soon as possible. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. And a special thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you: Adam Ananiadis, Jonas Namenson, Rusty Shackelford, Iron Shamrock, Jackson, Fightback CBD, Mike Roballs, Aunt Tifa, Lucky Buddha Beer, there are rice flakes in the beer, Random Candor, Fuzi Eunice, Dot Old Neon, Timothy Lee Peterson, Julius Caesar has Jungle Fever, Zach Taylor, Firebrand, Quasi, Jack Trey Bowles, Snepsts, I Said No Cops, Paulo Gomez, Alex, Kyle, and Neem.